Jim Brady, why he walked away from the Booth brothers for 12.5 years, Jim Brady stood shoulder to shoulder with Michael and Ronnie Booth, helping build one of the most decorated trios in Southern gospel music. Award after award. Number 1 songs. A reputation as one of the tightest harmony groups on the circuit. Then, in late 2014, he walked away. No scandal, no falling out. No dramatic exit interview, just a quiet, deliberate decision to step off one of gospel music's biggest stages and start something new with the person he loved most. This is the real story of why Jim Brady left the Booth brothers, and why, years later, he'd call it one of the best decisions he ever made. The singer who almost wasn't a Booth brother, Jim Brady's story in gospel music didn't start with the Booth brothers at all. He began singing at just 5 years old with his own family group, growing up immersed in Southern gospel harmony. By 16, he was already writing songs, a skill that would eventually produce more than 100 compositions recorded by some of the genre's biggest names. For nearly a decade, Jim toured with his wife Melissa's family group, the Shulers, alongside her father. It was steady, faithful ministry work, but it wasn't meant to last forever. When Melissa's father eventually came off the road, Jim found himself at a crossroads. That's when the Booth brothers called, initially just asking him to fill in. After a few weeks, Jim realized he didn't want to leave. He turned to Melissa, uncertain whether it was the right move for their young family. Her response settled it. She told him her home was wherever he was, and that she didn't want to hold him back from what felt like God opening a door. So Jim Brady became a Booth brother. What followed was more than a decade of chart-topping success. The cost nobody saw on stage from the outside, it looked like the perfect run. The Booth brothers were doing roughly 150 concerts a year, earning fan-voted honours again and again, and building a catalogue of songs that would become staples of Southern gospel radio. But behind the applause was a simpler, more human reality. That touring schedule kept Jim and Melissa apart for around 200 days out of every year. Melissa had always faithfully supported Jim's calling to the Booth brothers, and the two made the most of the time they had, singing together in churches and at concerts whenever his schedule allowed. But as the years went on, Melissa and Jim also began writing more music together, quietly building a joint catalogue of well over 200 songs. Melissa, who holds a master's certificate in songwriting from Berkeley, had music of her own that was starting to gain recognition too. Something was building. Not a crisis, just a growing sense that there might be a different chapter waiting for them. One they could walk into side by side rather than from opposite ends of a tour calendar. The decision by the summer of 2014, Jim and Melissa felt the timing was finally right. Not because anything had gone wrong with the Booth brothers, by every account, quite the opposite, but because they sensed a new calling forming for the two of them together. Jim has since described the decision in strikingly simple terms. There were no arguments, no unresolved tension, nothing dramatic behind the scenes. As he put it himself, there was no real reason to leave other than the sense that God was leading him into a new ministry alongside his wife. He's also been candid about the practical realities that shaped the timing. Balancing a full Booth brothers schedule with the ministry work he and Melissa wanted to build together simply wasn't sustainable. And, as Jim has said plainly, he wasn't getting any younger. The years together were something he and Melissa had come to treasure more than ever. So, in the fall of 2014, the Booth brothers announced that Jim would be stepping away at year's end, making way for Paul Lancaster to join Michael and Ronnie going forward. From January 2015, Jim and Melissa launched their new ministry, first as the Jim Brady Trio alongside musician Tim Parton, and later performing simply as Jim and Melissa Brady. Brothers, still what makes this story worth telling isn't just the decision itself, it's what happened to the relationships afterwards. Jim has spoken warmly, many times, about how much those 12.5 years with the Booth brothers meant to him, describing Michael and Ronnie as having become like brothers rather than simply colleagues. When the group told him, on his way out the door, once a Booth brother, always a Booth brother, it turned out to be more than a nice sentiment. In 2021, when Ronnie Booth stepped away from full-time touring to spend more time with his family, Michael Booth reached out to Jim about the possibility of returning. Scheduling made it impossible at first, but by January 2022, 7 years after he'd left, Jim Brady rejoined the Booth brothers, this time performing alongside Michael and newcomer Buddy Mullins, while continuing his ministry with Melissa on the side. Jim later described stepping back on that stage as feeling as though he and Michael had never been apart. Strip away any speculation, and what's left is a fairly simple story. A man who loved the group he sang with, who left not out of conflict but out of a shared calling with his wife, and who was welcomed back with open arms years later when the timing finally allowed it. There was no scandal here. Just two people choosing each other, a group of brothers who understood, and a friendship strong enough to survive a decision that could easily have ended it. Sometimes the most powerful gospel stories aren't found in the songs at all. They're found in the quiet choices made behind them.